question of whether or not reparations for slavery will be paid has been the subject of heated debate. People no longer trust that reparations for slavery will ever be paid, since the concept has been portrayed as so arcane. But what if we said that this is a hotly debated subject at the White House and other high-level American institutions? After all, the US government has funded everything from wars to peacekeeping operations and beyond. Paying reparations for slavery is an immediate necessity. As a matter of morality, the United States can no longer avoid it. Additionally, $350,000 was the previously determined amount of compensation. The new per-person cap is $151 million. Given that around 14% of Americans are black, the question becomes, who will foot the bill? Furthermore, will all African Americans receive the compensation funds? According to Black History Month, many Americans who are descended from slaves encounter baseless resistance when they seek reparations. Some people think there's no need to compensate them because they weren't there when slavery was happening. What about the white supremacists whose families have vast fortunes and acres of land? The continued appropriation of slave wealth by white supremacists begs the question, why shouldn't black Americans receive compensation for the wrongs done to their forefathers? The arguments against reparations are shown to be flawed by this. Paying each African American $360,000 was proposed in earlier studies by a number of State Departments and economists. This, however, was too little, as was known to everybody. In exchange for a small payment, the United States hoped to end the generations-long obligation. We are now talking about a sum of $151 million. This sum is enough for many, but who will foot the bill for the reparations when they eventually reach the trillions? Since no government has access to such a big sum, knowing this is crucial for determining its feasibility. Many proposals have surfaced. Using the land and money that descendants of white supremacists control now is one idea. The main point is that white slave owners' fortunes, which were earned on the backs of African Americans who were slaves, did not magically disappear when slavery was outlawed. It has instead been passed down via families, benefiting future generations financially. The racial gap in America's wealth, education, and opportunities is a direct outcome of this wrongdoing from the past. The inhumane practice of slavery, which persisted for generations in the USA, caused unimaginable anguish and agony to the enslaved and their offspring. It is imperative that this injustice be remedied. The idea that the federal government should foot the bill for repairs first got tossed around. It was contended that the involvement of the federal government in legitimizing slavery through constitutional protections and federal law was substantial. Consequently, it is critical to set up a specific fund for reparations. The argument that descendants of slaves shouldn't get reparations because they weren't there to experience the brutalities firsthand is the same argument that says descendants of white supremacist slave masters shouldn't keep the wealth that slavery created. It would be necessary to seize this fortune if this were to happen. From a legal and ethical standpoint, who should get this fortune? Slaves' descendants, who are still dealing with institutional racism, rightfully own this money. Black Americans have suffered enormous financial losses as a result of racism, with estimates ranging from the era of slavery all the way up to the present day, which amounts to an astounding $70 trillion. There is a close relationship between the historical wealth imbalance and this high expense. In 2016, the average middle-class white American family had $49,773 in wealth, compared to $1,134 for black households, a meager 8.6% of white families' wealth. In his book, The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America, Shah Rochester attributes this income difference to the lingering history of slavery. Rochester breaks down the $70 trillion in economic losses sustained by black Americans over many generations as a direct result of racism and prejudice. There is a large racial wealth gap that exists today, and this prejudice is a major factor. The wealth disparity has its roots in the 250 years of African enslavement, during which time people worked for free. The precise amount of money that was taken from African slaves between 1619 and 1865 is difficult to put a number on. However, estimates vary between $24 and $97 trillion. As a general rule, Rochester uses $50 trillion in his computations. Even though they worked hard to construct the country, Black Americans still only control around 2% of the wealth in the United States. Historically, government-sponsored programs aimed at enhancing wealth have consistently failed to include Black Americans. As an example, in 1863, they were not allowed to participate in the Homestead Act, which offered 160 acres of property to individuals for a small price and 5 years of cultivating the land. White homesteaders staked claims to 270 million acres, worth $1.6 trillion over 7 decades. Another $143 billion was lost because Black Americans were not included in the Social Security Act of 1935, and an additional $45 billion was lost because Black veterans were not granted benefits under the GI Bill of 1944. Just a friendly reminder to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button if you want us to keep making videos like this one. With your help, we can create a powerful community. All right, let's go on. Sometimes when African Americans tried to build their wealth networks and companies, they were violently resisted or sometimes killed. The horrific Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 is a good example. It occurred when a white mob destroyed Black-owned businesses in Tulsa, Oklahoma's affluent Greenwood district. This wealth disparity persisted in part because of these upheavals and because Black people were historically relegated to low-paying employment. Rochester considers losses sustained during the Jim Crow and civil rights eras, highlighting that Black Americans endured economic and racial segregation during this time, limiting their involvement in the American economy to come at the $70 trillion estimate. The wealth disparity between white and Black families is presently rather large, with white families owning around 10 times more wealth than Black families. Specifically, white college grads are 7 times wealthier than Black grads. In order for the American ideal to be realized in an equal way, the U.S. government must make amends to the descendants of African Americans for the wrongs it has done in the past. To help close the economic gap between different races, reparations should be in the form of monetary payments to each person. In addition to redressing educational, housing, and business ownership imbalances, these reparations should include programs to increase wealth. The total investments in industries and railroads exceeded the projected value of enslaved Black Americans' labor in 1860, which was almost $3 billion. Enslaved people's cotton output in 1861 was worth $250 million. The massive wealth that was created by slavery benefited the white slave owners and drove the economy of the country, while the enslaved people were prevented from accumulating riches. The federal government has failed to compensate the descendants of African American slaves for the equity they lost as a result of anti-Black laws in housing, transportation, and businesses, and the descendants of slaves have yet to get compensation for their labor. Redlining and other forms of discrimination, as well as historical injustices like slavery and Jim Crow segregation, have denied Black Americans the chance to build wealth. The racial wealth gap cannot be solved by only promoting personal effort and behavioral change. This is proven by the fact that Black college graduates have less wealth than white high school dropouts. Reparations are sometimes written off as a hopeless cause. On the other hand, the United States reparations history shows that the practice is not new to the country. After being forcibly removed from their ancestral homeland, Native Americans have been compensated monetarily and given land as reparations. West Germany agreed to pay 3.45 billion Deutsche Marks to Holocaust survivors in 1952, and Japanese Americans received $1.5 billion in reparations for their internment during World War II. The US government also helped ensure reparations for Holocaust survivors. with substantial investments over time through the Marshall Plan. While slavery did let some white families amass enormous fortunes, it has failed to compensate any group for the state-sanctioned racial discrimination that Black Americans endured. In spite of repeated chances to realize the American dream, the country failed to overcome slavery's lasting impact. The policy of 40 acres and a mule was originally introduced, but later withdrawn. There was a critical window of opportunity for America to make amends for slavery right after the Civil War ended. A number of prominent Union figures, notably General William Sherman, pushed for the land award of 40 acres to every black household. Black households were given 400,000 acres of seized Confederate land and, in addition to mules, by General Sherman in Field Order 15. After President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, however, President Andrew Johnson reversed Field Order 15, allowing the land to be returned to the original owners of the slaves. The federal government did more to embolden former slaves owners than to provide resources for African Americans to support themselves. Even the property of enslaved people was sometimes returned to their rightful owners. Due to a lack of other job opportunities, many enslaved Black Americans went back to the land they had once lived on and worked as sharecroppers, essentially for their masters. As America struggled to recover from the Great Depression and stock market crash of 1929, the New Deal came into being later in the decade. Approximately $50 billion, or about $50 trillion now, was the anticipated cost of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs. The GI Bill and Social Security, two vital parts of the New Deal, did not do enough to deal with racial inequalities. Local GI Bill implementation was impeded by racial housing restrictions and redlining, making it so that Black World War II veterans could not fully enjoy post-war benefits on par with white veterans. Social Security, meanwhile, did not cover domestic workers or agricultural laborers, two occupations that may have contributed much to greater equality in the United States. It was because of this exclusion that 60% of black workers in the country and 75% in the South were marginalized. During the Great Depression, these clauses were inserted into the statute to benefit the largely white population, while black soldiers and laborers were penalized. The United States must pass a thorough federal reparations plan for African Americans in order to fulfill its promise to end the racial wealth disparity and preserve the ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Although other oppressed groups have received reparations, the federal government has refused to do the same for Black Americans. The United States government has been trying to avoid paying reparations since it simply does not have the resources to do so. But now that a workable solution is available, the only explanation for the non-payment of compensation is malice. Taking money and land from people who were slave owners has to be the main goal. Now more than ever before is the time to trace this out. The descendants of former slave owners might be located through research into their estates and riches. A reparations fund can be established by taxing them. Although reparation is doable and practical, it has not gotten nearly enough focus. The fact that the majority of white Americans are racist and opposed to reparations, the practice of returning property and wealth that was formerly owned by slaves, is deeply troubling. Serves as an unethical yardstick. They're eager to hang on to the riches received through exploitation, but unwilling to pay restitution. It makes one wonder how African Americans would do in a nation that recognizes no one but white people as citizens. U.S. Representative Cori Bush introduced a bill in May 2023 to compensate African Americans for the harms done by slavery and the Jim Crow period. The bill called for $14 trillion in reparations. This new plan, which is part of a larger democratic effort to compensate Black Americans for years of injustice, is known as the Reparations Now bill. A Reuters poll found that while 18% of Republicans agree with the need for reparations, 58% of Democrats do. Furthermore, 74% of Black Americans are in favor of reparations, but only 26% of white Americans are in favor, according to the report. A final report was submitted to the California legislature by the task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans in that state. The report's thorough analysis covered a lot of ground, including how slavery affected African Americans and how that hurt is still with us now. The report proposes a thorough reparations strategy that addresses the injustices suffered by those impacted, presenting more than 115 suggestions. The study did call for financial compensation for affected parties, but it did not set a specific figure, so lawmakers are free to decide. So, what's your take on this? Will reparations for slavery be paid, or is it a concept that remains vague? Would you be in favor of the US government announcing reparations for slavery? Use the space below to express yourself and share your opinions. Are you interested in seeing more videos from us? If so, we would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon to show your support. More videos are available on our channel for your viewing pleasure.